The clang of shields, the scent of sweat and iron. Dust settles on the faces of people whose bodies have long forgotten what rest is. Warriors of Rome march along a stony road, covering 25 kilometers a day. On their shoulders, 40 kilograms of equipment. Behind their backs, a sword, a shield, and a mess kit. It was this very mess kit that often decided whether a legion would survive or fall. In it boiled what saved them from hunger and fatigue. A simple yet almost sacred porridge, without which Rome would not have built its empire. But how could one dish keep an entire army in formation? And why do archaeologists still debate what exactly it consisted of? The answer is hidden not in books, but in the embers of ancient campfires found near Naples and in Britain. Roman legions did not just eat, they followed a strict ritual of sustenance created for survival. The historian Polybius wrote that discipline began not with the sword, but with food. Each legionary received grain, about 900 grams a day, but not in the form of bread, but as a raw product that he had to grind, cook, and eat himself. This was pulse, Roman spelt, a thick wheat porridge that was called the heart of the legion. Spelt is not just porridge, but a source of slow strength. Its grains were cracked between stones, then mixed with water, sometimes with salt and herbs. The result was a mass, thick as clay and hot as Italy itself in summer. This sticky, viscous porridge legionaries cooked directly over campfires. It smelled of smoke and sweat, the aromas of campaigning life. It was in it that there was fuel for endless marches, for night watches and morning battles. The term pulse denoted not just food, but a system. It was a standard, like a shield or a spear. An individual legionary had no right to demand more or less. Each received exactly as much as was due, according to the norm established back under Consul Camillus in the 4th century BC. Spelt became not only food, but also a symbol of equality. The rich legionary and the poor ate the same thing, and, as Livy wrote, Rome was sustained not by bread, but by the porridge its soldiers cooked. Imagine the smell of a night camp. Tar torches burn, smoke spreads across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of a forge is heard, where iron is being hammered. And above the mess kits, steam billows, mixed with the voices of hundreds of people who know tomorrow's day will be hard, but strength will be given to them by this simple mixture of grains and water. Archaeological findings confirm, in Roman camps near Mainz, Carthage, and York, charred remains of spelt were found. Even after 2,000 years, they preserved microparticles of starch, a chemical trace of Roman discipline. In each of these fragments, the history of millions of steps and countless campaigns. And yet, how could such simple food replace everything else? How did warriors, deprived of wine, meat, and oil, cover hundreds of kilometers and enter battle with unwavering strength? Perhaps the secret was not in the composition, but in the ritual. Every evening they cooked pulse not just as food, but as part of a rite. An act of unity, when the entire cohort ate the same way. This transformed ordinary porridge into a symbol of the army, where the personal was erased for the sake of the collective. But one day this ritual changed. When Rome became an empire, new products appeared in the legionaries' diet, and simple porridge gave way to more complex dishes. Why and how did the change in diet affect the strength of the legion? The answer lies in what the warriors ate on the eve of the greatest campaigns, from Gaul to Parthia, when the fate of the empire depended on a single spoon of porridge. The thunder of steps on stone slabs, dust rises into the air, the sun blazes, and on the horizon, only gleaming spears and a hot haze. In every pack, next to weapons and utensils, a small bag of grain. This was not just provisions. This was life. Without it, the legion turned into a crowd of the doomed. A legionary carried about 30 kilograms of personal load, and most of it was not weapons, but food, grain, his armor against hunger, his sole guarantee of endurance. Every evening, as soon as the camp was set up, the same ritual began. Soldiers dug pits for hearths, gathered dry branches, and made fire, without haste, almost silently. Then they took out a small iron or bronze pot from behind their backs. This item was called a patera, a marching bowl, from which they ate, drank, and prayed. It had no decorations, but it was more valuable than gold, because without it, survival was impossible. The sound with which the grain fell into the boiling water was a signal to the entire camp. The water hissed, turning into thick porridge. Legionnaires added herbs, coriander, celery, sometimes even a pinch of salt if it hadn't run out. And if they were lucky, a piece of lard or cheese acquired from the nearest village. But more often, only spelt in water. The term pasca referred to the drink with which they washed down this porridge. It was a mixture of water and vinegar, sour, sharp, but refreshing. It was called the soldier's drink. Modern biochemists confirm such a mixture indeed quenched thirst better than plain water and prevented infections. In the heat of Gaul or Syria, pasca saved more than a sword. Polybius wrote that legionnaires ate austere, but with dignity. This diet, spelt in vinegar, shaped their character. The taste of Roman victory was not sweet. It was tart, sour, and hot, like their food. One of the archaeological camps near Vindobona, modern Vienna, preserved traces of such kitchens. Dozens of small fire pits were found in the ground, and in them charred pieces of grains. Under the microscope, researchers determined that these were spelt and barley, precisely the crops mentioned by Livy and Appian. Romans cooked porridge everywhere they were stationed, from northern Britain to the Sahara. And now, one important image. Imagine a formation of 6,000 men, weary, sun-scorched, silently sitting in a circle, each with a mess kit. They do not speak, do not argue, do not celebrate. Only the rustle of spoons and the crackle of campfires. This is not a feast, not a banquet. This is an act of survival, an act of unity. Here there are no slaves and masters. Here are only soldiers, and all have the same spoon, the same taste. It was this that transformed disparate people from different provinces into a unified force, feared even by Parthian horse archers. Porridge became a weapon of discipline. Its monotony killed weakness. As Tacitus wrote, the Roman learned patience with a spoon. The food was minimal, but stable. Even on campaigns where supplies failed, every warrior knew there is grain, and therefore Rome will not fall. However, in this strict diet, another side was hidden. Archaeological findings show that in a later period, already under Augustus, legionaries began to cook pulse not only from spelt, but also from wheat and barley. Sometimes they added meat, if the campaign allowed. Thus a new dish appeared, pulse militaris, military porridge, more nutritious and thick. This was no longer just a symbol of equality, but a tool for survival in long campaigns. The term frumentum, that is what the grain ration issued to each legionary was called. Even part of the pay was calculated from it. If a soldier lost grain, it was considered a disciplinary offense, almost like losing a weapon. For to lose food meant to doom oneself and comrades. Modern researchers calculated one portion of pulse provided about 2,000 calories, enough to march 30 kilometers with a full load. This was the energetic equivalent of modern army rations. But unlike modern field rations, Roman porridge required effort. It had to be prepared by oneself. This was not just food, but a test of character. And here, in this constancy, lies the key. When the sun set and the noise in the camp died down, a Roman would sit by the fire, scoop up the thick porridge with a spoon, and look into the flames. He knew that tomorrow there would be another march. Again heat, again fatigue. But as long as pulse boiled in the mess kit, everything was under control. The empire rested on this taste, heavy, smoky, yet providing strength. Over time, simple porridge became a measure of endurance, almost a symbol of loyalty. When, during the time of Trajan, the army reached the borders of Mesopotamia, it was pulse militaris that helped them survive in the waterless lands. It did not demand much, only fire and a little grain. This was food created not for pleasure, but for victory. But why did the Romans, possessing the richest lands, not allow themselves luxury in food even at the peak of their power? Why could their emperors feast in gold, while soldiers continued to eat porridge as if they were paupers? The answer lies not only in discipline, but also in the philosophy of Rome itself, where simplicity was considered a virtue, and taste secondary to duty. It is in this contradiction that the secret is born, which explains why the Roman army remained invincible for centuries. The heat of midday, dust, scorching breath. The column moves along a road paved with stone already under Augustus. Ahead, standard-bearers with the legion's eagle. Behind, wagons with provisions. They were called muli, mules, but these were not animals. That's what legionaries called each other among themselves, because each carried his burden like a beast. On their shoulders, armor, on their backs, a sack of grain. This was the essence of the Roman soldier, not only a warrior, but also a carrier for his own army. According to Marius's regulations, end of the 2nd century BC, each legionary was obliged to carry with him up to a 4-day supply of grain. This was not by chance. Marius's reform transformed the army from a temporary militia into a professional force. Along with his sword, the soldier received responsibility for his own sustenance, and it was then that pulse became not just food, but a symbol of the warrior's self-reliance. He did not wait for supplies, he carried them on himself. The term sarcina denoted the legionary's full marching kit, weapons, utensils, a mess kit, and a sack of grain. The total weight reached 40 kilograms. Only those who could withstand such a load were admitted to the army. It was no coincidence that commanders said, "The strength of the legion is not in spears, but in legs." And this was not a metaphor. Polybius wrote directly that Roman endurance astonished enemies more than their swords. Pulse porridge was at the center of this system. In the morning it was eaten cold, in the evening fresh was cooked, without bread, without oil, without wine. Sometimes, when supplies improved, a little pork fat or garlic was added, but more often, nothing. This scarcity made the body economical, the physique strong, and the will firm. Tacitus noted, "The simpler the food, the slower the warrior dies." Imagine, under Marsov Hill, where in antiquity a training camp stood, young recruits first cooked their porridge. Smoke stung their eyes, and nearby a centurion, in a hoarse voice, explained how to grind the grain, how much water to add, how not to overcook it. A mistake cost them a day's food. This skill became part of their military training, on par with fencing and formation. The taste of this porridge was the taste of Roman endurance. Not salty, not spicy, but dull and thick, like army life itself. Archaeologists found in the Israeli fortress of Masada remains of legionaries' utensils. At the bottom of the bowls, traces of roasted grain, traces of oil, rare specks of salt. Even there, among the sands and stone, Romans did not deviate from their tradition. The symbolism of pulse extended far beyond food. In the army, they said, "He who eats porridge serves Rome. He who demands bread serves himself." And this was not just a phrase. In a society where patricians ruled with feasts and the populace received free bread, a nona, legionaries contrasted themselves with the city dwellers. They ate what made them part of the empire's machinery. Archaeological data from the camp near Kare, modern Turkey, show that in places where difficult campaigns were conducted, legionaries often replaced spelt with barley. This variant was called pulse hordaceae. Barley was coarser, but provided more energy. The historian Vegetius wrote that even punishment for an offense sometimes consisted of being transferred to a barley diet. That is, even grain became a measure of discipline, a reward or a penalty. But discipline did not negate humanity. In letters of legionaries found on wooden tablets in Vindolanda, in northern Britain, lines appear: "Send salt and oil. Here our porridge is bland, like grass." This is the voice of a living person, tired of the simplicity of campaign life, but still continuing to follow the rules. The sensory world of a Roman camp was unique. The smell of smoke, the crunch of roasted grains, the tangy taste of pasca, the clinking of spoons against bronze. All this, the sounds of an empire on the march. Not triumphant trumpets, but the quiet rustle of food cooked in silence, because this was what nourished the Roman war machine. Modern research shows that a legionary's diet, based on spelt and barley, provided not only calories but also a balance of minerals necessary for high exertion. No coincidences, everything was thought out. Even simplicity had strategic meaning. Grain did not spoil, did not require oil, did not depend on hunting or supplies. However, this diet was not eternal. With the growth of the empire and the emergence of new provinces, exotic ingredients began to penetrate the diet. Lentils, chickpeas, olive oil. Not only the food changed, but also the very spirit of the army. With the advent of abundance came weakness, old centurions said. And when the empire stretched from Spain to Syria, many wondered, could an army accustomed to satiety withstand the same trials as its ancestors, who were fed by spelt alone? The answer to this question would begin to unfold at the next turning point in history, when the legionaries' food would become a mirror of the empire's decline, when the mess kit with porridge would cease to be a symbol of strength and turn into a reminder of how easily satiety kills discipline. Wind drives sand across the camp. The sun dips towards sunset, and against the backdrop of the blazing sky, brass mess kits shimmer. The empire was no longer the same. Now legionaries ate not only spelt, but also bread, meat, olive oil. Their diet became richer, but it was precisely in this richness that a crack was hidden, which no one then suspected. The historian Tacitus wrote that effeminacy begins with food. And the Roman army step by step entered an era of comfort that would one day weaken it to its foundations. After the reforms of Augustus, the legionaries' diet was standardized by province. In the north, barley. In Africa, wheat. In Syria, a mixture of grains and beans. According to the calculations of the historian Goldsworthy, the daily norm was about 900 grams of grain, 30 grams of oil, and a little cheese. Sometimes meat or fish were added, if supplies allowed. But pulse militaris remained obligatory. No day began without it. The term culina castrensis referred to the legion's campaign kitchen. Its arrangement was strictly regulated. In each camp of 10 tents, contubernia, one pit was allocated for a common hearth. A fire always burned in it. This fire was carried from camp to camp, and thus it was said that the Roman army carries its warmth across the entire land. On it they cooked porridge, dried bread, boiled pasca. Even in the mountains of Armenia or the deserts of Egypt, where there was no firewood, legionaries sought camel dung, just to keep the kitchen's flame from dying out. But along with the expansion of the empire, recruits from distant provinces began to arrive in the army. Gauls, Germans, Illyrians. They brought their own tastes. Some added honey to the porridge, others garlic, still others even pieces of smoked meat. Gradually, the food lost its former strictness. Archaeologists found in the fortress of Dura Europus on the banks of the Euphrates remains of pots in which, along with spelt, traces of spices, coriander, pepper, and even sesame were discovered. This meant that even on the eastern borders of the empire, Roman porridge was no longer the same. It was transforming into a multifaceted symbol of imperial diversity. But something in this diversity troubled the senior officers. Legates wrote in reports that soldiers had become more demanding, complaining more often about the quality of provisions. Once a Roman could survive on spelt and vinegar alone. Now warriors demanded oil, bread, wine. A crack appeared in discipline. A centurion raised in old traditions told recruits, "The empire will perish not by the sword, but by the stomach." However, it cannot be said that the army simply relaxed. New dishes sometimes saved lives. In the hot climate of Syria and Egypt, soldiers began to mix porridge with dates and honey, creating a quickly digestible food similar to a modern energy bar. This variant was called pulse dulcis, sweet porridge. Archaeological data confirms its existence. In Antioch, a vessel was found with remains of grains and caramelized fruits dated to the 2nd century AD. But the main difference of the new era was that porridge ceased to be equal for everyone. Wealthy centurions bought additional products while ordinary legionaries ate what the supplies provided. Food once again became an indicator of status, and in this, Rome returned to old habits it had once abandoned. The term annona militaris, the state norm for army supply. The empire now provided grain centrally, sending ships with provisions from Egypt and Sicily. But dependence on supplies turned into disaster if the supply chain broke. When troops in the east revolted under Emperor Septimius Severus, legions for weeks ate only the remains of old grain, soured in the holds of ships. In despair, the soldiers returned to the old pulse, cooked over smoky fires from charred grains. This simple food saved them once again. The irony of fate. In moments of crisis, the empire survived precisely thanks to what it tried to move away from. Its porridge, rough and honest, like military discipline itself. When roads broke, when warehouses burned, only this mixture of grain and water continued to keep the army on its feet. But in this strength there was also the shadow of future defeat. The further Rome moved away from its roots, the wider grew the chasm between those who remembered the taste of spelt and those accustomed to satiety. In the late empire, legionaries no longer always cooked pools themselves. Camp servants did this. And along with this, the main thing disappeared: personal participation in one's own survival. As long as the empire grew, pool's porridge remained its heart. But when the flames of the hearths in the camps became sparse, and a soldier's spoon no longer touched his mess kit, something inside the Roman army began to slowly die. And at the moment when the enemies approached the Rhine, no one remembered how delicious spelt smelled, cooked in the cold wind. The smell of strength that was no longer there. The dim flame of campfires reflects on helmets. Evening, 3rd century AD. The empire is already cracking at the seams. In the north, Germans press. In the east, Persians rise. Inside, turmoil and hunger. But even now, when order is collapsing, legionaries still take grain from their sacks. Time has changed, but the ritual remained. In the old mess kit, porridge boils again. It smells of smoke, ash, and scorched earth, the taste of war and the end. Those who then served on the borders were no longer Romans in the old sense. Among them, Syrians, Illyrians, Gauls. The empire became a mixture of peoples, but the food remained common. Archaeological data from camps on the Danube and Rhine show, in the 4th century AD, soldiers still ate a grain mixture similar to the ancient pulse. Only now traces of beans and lentils are found in it, cheap substitutes for spelt, which had become scarce. The food itself reflected the poverty of the era. The term panis militaris meant military bread, which appeared in the later centuries of the empire. It was baked in mobile ovens made of clay and bronze. It was hard as stone and did not spoil for a long time. But to bake it, time, firewood, and flour were needed. When these were lacking, legionaries returned to porridge again. Thus, pulse became a symbol not only of endurance but also of decline. Historians debate when exactly this ancient ritual disappeared. Some say that under Constantine the Great, the army finally switched to bread. Others, that in remote garrisons on the borders, porridge was still cooked for centuries. But all agree on one thing. It was simple food that helped them survive in the darkest times. Even when the empire lost cities and legions, grain remained the last hope. Imagine a late Roman camp in the rain. Mud squelches underfoot, tents sag, warriors stand wrapped in woolen cloaks. By the fire, a mess kit boils, and nearby, a centurion, old, with scars on his face. He silently stirs the porridge. Young soldiers, half hungry, look at him, and suddenly he utters, "As long as the porridge is cooking, Rome lives." This is not a slogan, but the truth. Food became the empire's last language, understood by all. According to various sources, the last mention of Pulse Militaris is found in the letters of a legionary from Thebaid, Egypt, around 460 AD. He complains that grain supplies are not arriving, and soldiers are cooking grains with dust, like our grandfathers under Camillus. In this phrase, a bridge across 6 centuries, the same taste, the same fatigue. The term anane in the late empire no longer meant only supply, but also a tax. Grain was levied from the provinces for the army. This led to rebellions, to the flight of peasants. To feed the legions, the empire devastated its own fields. And again, porridge boiled in the mess kits, but now it smelled not of victory, but of hunger. Archaeological traces of this decline are particularly expressive. In former camps near Regensburg and Nicopolis, remains of campfires are found where, instead of grain, there are overburnt wheat stalks and charred beans. This means that legionaries cooked everything they could find. Where once thick pulse boiled, now dirty gruel bubbled. But even in this despair, something majestic was preserved. Warriors continued to share food equally. The principle of contubernium, comradeship, lived on in them. 10 men to 1 tent, 1 mess kit for all, 1 spoon passing around. This was the last remnant of old Rome, a sense of brotherhood, cemented not by oath but by a spoon of porridge. When the Western Empire fell in 476 AD, the last legion under Orestes was still stationed in northern Italy. Chronicles state that on the eve of their surrender, the soldiers ate boiled grain without oil. That same porridge with which Rome began also turned out to be its last dish. There is a terrible symmetry in this. From the spelt eaten by Romulus's peasant to the barley cooked by the soldiers of the last legion, almost 5 centuries passed. But the essence remained. Simple food, uniting people who held formation even when the world was collapsing. And yet, paradoxically, it was this simplicity that outlived the empire. Peasants, barbarians, monks, all of them adopted this Roman way of preparing grain. Thus, pulse transformed into the progenitor of European porridges, gruels, even Italian polenta. But in it still lives the spirit of that very strength, patient, hot, silent. And somewhere beneath layers of earth, among the ruins of legionary camps, archaeologists still find traces of those ancient mess kits. But if you place your palm on them, it seems you can feel a remnant of warmth. The warmth of hands that built the empire and fed it from one simple bowl. But within this warmth lies a question that has endured through centuries. What made these people invincible? The sword or the porridge they shared by the campfire? The answer lies in the final chapter of this story, where Roman porridge transforms from a military necessity into a symbol of human resilience, understandable even today. When Rome fell, it seemed that everything that sustained its world would disappear with it. But pulse survived. It transitioned into monastic kitchens, where monks prepared poor man's porridge, a mixture of grains and water, almost an exact replica of the legionary dish. Through centuries, this recipe became part of peasant Europe. In Italy, polenta. In France, bouli. In Spain, gachas. All of them a reflection of one ancient taste, inherited from the army that conquered the world. And in this, there is a strange justice. The empire disappeared, but its food remained. For the essence of Rome was not in the marble of its forums, nor in the armor of its legionaries, but in the habit of sharing the last among equals. Where porridge boils, there order lives, even without standards and eagles. Today, archaeologists call pulse the food of resilience. In every shard found, in every grain that survived 2,000 years, there is testimony that the empire's strength lay not only in swords, but in the ability to survive. Rome fell, but its porridge did not. And perhaps it is precisely that, its true legacy: hot, simple, requiring nothing but patience and fire. Thus concludes the story that began with a grain dropped into the dust of an Italian field, a grain from which grew an empire capable of feeding and defending itself. When the legions vanished, the flames of the hearths did not die out. It passed into human memory, to where simple food becomes a symbol of eternal endurance.